listening to the Today's Mama podcast with your host, Rachael Hersher.
This episode of the podcast is all about anxiety. We talk a lot about kids and bounce between teenagers, elementary school kids, and preschoolers, but I promise there is something in this episode for everyone, including you. We live in an anxiety-filled world, and I think you'll find that there's probably something here for you too. So enjoy Dr. Meg Meeker. Today we welcome pediatrician, mother, best-selling author of 6 books, Dr. Meg Meeker, whom I might add has been called America's Mother by Dave Ramsey. Welcome, Meg. So excited to catch up with you again.
Oh, well, thanks for having me, Rachael.
And I have to tell you, I almost named one of my girls Meg. You have like one of my favorite names in the world. Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you. And, interestingly enough, I'm a Margaret Meg. A lot of people are Meg and Meg. And I was named after my grandmother. So it's not often you find people who are named Meg, but their real name's Margaret.
Yeah, I know. I would have thought you were a Megan, but I love just the Meg.
Thank you.
You and I did an episode of your show a couple months ago. I was a lucky guest on Meg's show, and we talked all about disciplining toddlers through teens. I think we exuded brilliance.
I hope so.
And I'll put a link to that episode in the show notes. So I'm sure when we get to the end of this, most people will say, I can't get enough of those two. Give me more. And there it will be.
Great.
So today we're talking anxiety, kids, and what to do about it. But before we get to that, I and our listeners, I think, need to know a little bit more about you. You live in northern Michigan. I hear wonderful and terrifying things about that part of the country.
It's very beautiful. Summertime is fabulous. The only difficulty in living in northern Michigan, it's kind of like being in Minnesota. We have very long and tough winters. But if you like winter and the snow and skiing, it really can be fun. So we all like being outside a lot, my husband and I and our kids who are grown now. So we really like it.
Yeah. And do you live by any lakes?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. In all of Michigan, I think you're never than 6 miles away from a body of water. So we have Lake Michigan and we have a lot of inland lakes around me.
I feel like I could be all about the lake life. Michigan in the summertime, I think would be my happy spot.
Yes.
So Meg, if I were to travel to Michigan, where should I go? What would my ultimate lake life destination be?
I think Charlevoix and Petoskey are very beautiful. They're on Lake Michigan, and that's a beautiful, beautiful place to be. A lot of people vacation there, or you could go to one of the inland lakes, or you could go to anywhere along the western coast of Michigan, and you can't go wrong.
Okay, I need this to happen in my life. The only thing that maybe keeps me back here in Salt Lake City is, will I get ticks up there? Is that a big deal? I feel like you guys live in ticks.
No, it really isn't. We do have ticks, but honestly, I've never seen Lyme disease up here in 30 years.
I just have revealed my own anxiety and my own WebMD tendencies that I'm like, oh, it's tick country. I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, where did you grow up? Did you grow up in Michigan?
No, I grew up outside of Boston and I went to an all-women's college, Mount Holyoke College. I moved to Cincinnati and went to medical school there, which is fabulous. And then I went and did my residency at Children's Hospital of Wisconsin. And then we've been practicing. My husband and I practiced together. We started our practice and now we have 8 doctors. So it's really fun.
Okay, so tell me this. You guys are in the same practice. You're both doctors. How did you manage that? Med school, fellowships, having babies, raising kids?
Sure. Well, after we finished medical school, my husband was 2 years ahead of me. We had a baby. And we decided that it was too much for her to have both of us working 90 hours a week. So he said, if I stay home, I'll go back in 3 years. But he said to me, I'm afraid if you stay home, you may never go back. So I actually worked and did my residency for 3 years, and he was Mr. Mom, and it was fabulous.
Evidence that you married the right man.
Yes.
Right? That you're both invested so much in each other's hopes and dreams and successes that you can do that juggle together.
It was fabulous. It was wonderful for us. And people say, well, how do you work together? And I say, working together is easy. Raising kids together is the tough part.
Oh, well, I've heard that about a Christmas present story. Well, I don't know the story. I've just been told that I need to hear this story. So hopefully you know what I'm talking about. Can you tell me?
So when I was doing my residency, Walt really was fabulous. He took care of our daughter and he began gardening and, doing a lot of fun stuff with our daughter. And he started sewing. And one Christmas, I opened a gift and I saw this blue coat. It was made of boiled wool. And I thought, that's really nice. Thank you so much. And we got on a plane, and 3 days later, we were flying back to Boston to see my family. And I said, this is a really beautiful coat. Where did you get it? Because it didn't have a tag in the back of it. And he looked at me and he said, well, I made it. And that coat I wore through 3 pregnancies, and I still have the coat, and it was just incredibly meaningful to me. And I just thought that was extraordinary, particularly for a man who is staying home, who really wasn't, the sensitive kind. Doing something like that was very unusual.
I love that. Our husbands are cut from the same cloth. I hope you just got that pun I made, because my husband is a seamster.
Oh.
And he is very much, you wouldn't look at him and say, oh, you're a sewer.
Yeah.
He is very much like a mountain man, loves to trail run and climb and hike. And,
that's my
he's
husband.
A dude. Yeah,
Yes.
but he is the best seamster. He's sewn me backpacks. When I was pregnant, he would alter maternity shorts and pants for me.
Oh,
He's the one who makes all our Halloween costumes. I mean, and he goes big.
yeah. Oh, how fun.
Yeah. So,
oh, how fun.
I mean, anybody out there who is not married, you look for a man that sews and you will win the lottery.
Yes, that's right.
Oh, well, I love that. I'm going to need to see a picture of this coat.
I will send you one. It's just fabulous.
Well, I have to go back to your childhood really quick before we move on, because there's a question I ask all our guests, and it is, in essence, what was the smell of your childhood? So there was a scene in the movie Ratatouille towards the end when the food critic receives his dish that was made by a rat of ratatouille, and he smells it, and it transports him back in time to being in the house he grew up in, and his mom, giving him this plate of ratatouille, and he felt home and he felt loved.
Yes.
Everybody's had such interesting answers. So what was the smell of your childhood? What takes you back?
That's a great question. Actually, pipe smoke, because my dad always smoked a pipe. Every once in a while, I would go to work with him. We would do chores in the yard. We fished a lot, so we spent a lot of time in a canoe. And I loved the smell of that. That would remind me of my dad. The other thing that would remind me of my childhood is pot roast. My mother cooked all the time. She was a fabulous cook, and she did very homey cooking. Mashed potatoes, meatloaf, pot roast. I just loved that. It made me feel very warm. So it would be those 2 things.
I love that. And I feel like it's very Boston. I'm just picturing the pipe. I see you in like a blueberry patch somewhere. Maybe that's more Maine, but
yes.
I love that. Love it. Now, this is going to be a rough transition because those are wonderful feelings, and we're going to transition into the anxious feelings, the ones about me and tics and kids feeling anxious. For this episode, I tried something new. I posted on my @today'smama on Instagram. I posted to our Instagram stories and asked for some questions from, our followers. And I got some really great questions and comments back. And so I'm going to hit some of those as well as some of my own. But I think the best place to start is, let's start with a definition. Define the anxious child. What are the signs and symptoms that you're looking for when you're diagnosing a child with anxiety?
That's a great question. First of all, I've been practicing a little over 30 years, and I have seen an increase in the amount of anxiety I see. And I also see it in younger children. And I'm trying to figure out why this is. And one of the reasons I think is our kids live very, very busy lives. and they don't live in a very quiet world. I think they're very stimulated. So any fears or anxiety they have is really magnified because they're around a lot of stimulation. So, there are different types of anxiety that kids can have. There's basically 4 kinds of anxiety. There's generalized anxiety. There's social anxiety. Kids have a difficult time going to school and walking into their classroom. There's panic disorders, of course. And then there's specific phobias. I was bitten by a dog and I'm afraid of dogs. Your ticks. I don't like ticks. Some kids are afraid of, a monster or under their bed, or they'll see a television show with a scene in it that's terribly frightening. So those are the kind of different anxiety issues kids can have.
And do you think it's gotten worse over time, or are we talking about it more?
Well, I think both. I think that we've started to recognize it easier in children. I think parents are looking for it, but I do think that there's a higher incidence of anxiety because, as I said, their worlds are not quiet. They're very busy. They're very crazy. Kids are running around. School is harder. For instance, my granddaughter was going to start kindergarten, but she's going to delay a year because my daughter said, Mom, kindergarten now is like first grade. And I don't want to put her through that because that would make her anxious. So I do think there's both going on.
And, I Googled for some stats before we got on, and this had more to do with high school and college students. But for some estimates, I got this from Psychology Today, and I'll put a link in the show notes, but it says they estimate that 5 to 8 times as many high school and college students meet the criteria for anxiety or major depression than a half century or more ago.
Yeah.
And that's a lot.
It is a lot. And I think, again, there's a lot to make kids very anxious. Some kids who live in different parts of the country are more anxious than others. For instance, the coast, California, Washington, Boston, New York, because those are areas where kids are pushed very hard in school at a very young age, and they worry about getting into elementary school or junior high or the high school and then college. So I think there's a lot of pressure on kids. You go to the major cities, New York, Washington, and there's definitely more anxiety in kids among the bigger cities.
And there is a high school here just outside of Salt Lake City that has had 6 or 7 as of May this year, suicides this year in their high school. And that is almost viral in a way.
It's terrifying. Well, there are a couple of things. Anxiety can come with depression. There's comorbidity that we say. And often anxious kids, anorexia nervosa, for instance, kids are anxious and they're depressed. There's another factor going on, which is very disturbing. And that is when kids see or hear about other people committing suicide, even watching the show 13 Reasons Why.
I was going to bring that show up.
Yeah, it gives kids the idea that, this is an option. And it's really like monkey see, monkey do. That increases the amount of, and this does it in adults as well. And actually a show like that is horrible for anxiety and depression in kids because kids look at it and go, oh, well, she did it. And she did it, and he did it. And again, it gets them thinking about it, and they follow a trend or a crowd.
Yeah, which is terrifying. And you brought up a word that struck with me is it gives them an option.
Yeah.
So it's almost like we have to be meeting those kids with a whole lot better options, right?
Yes, we do. And I think when there are suicides in the news, we need to sort of keep our kids away from it because what happens in the media is they ruminate on it. They talk about it over and over and over. And then again, shows like 13 Reasons, parents will let their kids watch them with the best intentions, thinking, well, this will prevent my child from being depressed or committing suicide, when actually it does the exact opposite because it keeps kids thinking about suicide. So we really need to steer them away from thinking about it. We need to give them other options, and we need to be able to recognize depression when it's happening and get our kids good treatment.
There's another stat I pulled, and this was from the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. And it's that Anxiety and depression are treatable, but 80% of kids with a diagnosable anxiety disorder and 60% of kids with diagnosable depression are not getting treatment.
Right. And I would believe that. And one of the reasons why, or there are a couple reasons, I think that parents fail to see anxiety and depression in kids and teenagers because it doesn't look like anxiety and depression in adults. Kids who have these two things, I always like to say it comes out sideways. Kids can start acting obnoxious. They can start yelling at their parents, I hate you. They can start spending a lot of time alone in their rooms. And many parents say, well, they're teenagers. This is what they're supposed to do. Not really. It's normal for kids to spend an hour or two in their rooms after school, but not the whole evening, day after day after day. These are kids who are depressed and avoiding parents. That's really important. The other thing is when kids are depressed, they don't just walk up to you and say, hey, mom, I'm depressed. And parents often don't want to confront it because it makes them feel like bad parents. And they don't want to see it because it feels shameful, it's embarrassing, and they just want to avoid it as well. So I think those are the two main factors why we're not getting kids treatment.
You're listening to the Today's Mama podcast with your host, Rachael Hersher. We'll be back right after this.
We're talking about anxiety today, and we all know too much technology and social media are part of the problem. Meet Circle. Circle pairs with your home Wi-Fi and lets you manage every connected device on your network, both wireless and wired, without ever needing to put software on them. Set time limits for different apps and categories, give your devices a bedtime, filter out the bad stuff, and you can even pause the internet. Managing online screen time and content has never been easier. Check it out at meetcircle.com.
And now back to the Today's Mama podcast with your host, Rachael Hersher.
This brings me to one of the questions we got from one of our Instagram followers. When is it time to see your pediatrician or doctor?
As far as anxiety, I think that if you're seeing your kids avoiding you or avoiding situations, when they have somatic symptoms, a lot of headaches, a lot of stomach aches, a lot of pain. For instance, kids who don't like school may wake up in the morning and go, Mom, I have a stomach ache over and over and over. They can have difficulty sleeping, or they'll wake up in the middle of the night where previously they had no sleep issues. They might come and need a lot of reassurance. Anxiety, at the root of anxiety, even depression, is fear. And they may feel something bad is going to happen to me. Something bad is going to happen to me. So they need a lot of reassurance from parents. Also, if their grades suddenly drop or their school performance, if they're explosive and show a lot of oppositional behavior, oppositional defiant disorder, a lot of times it really isn't ODD, it's anxiety. And then, of course, there can be eating problems. Kids can start starving or they can start overeating. So those are the kind of things parents want to watch for.
And, I think a lot of parents worry about, okay, well, if I take them to the doctor, then they're just going to put my kid on medications. So, that creates a stigma and a fear. Right. And I think there's a lot of options outside of that. Maybe medication wouldn't necessarily be my first choice. How can people make sure that their pediatrician's a right fit for them, maybe in approach? Or if they're not, how do you find another one that's going to work with you?
Well, I think that by the time your child has anxiety, hopefully your pediatrician pretty well. And you can, usually sort of figure out whether one who's quick to prescribe medications or not. But most good pediatricians don't want to start with medication in children, even in teenagers. We always start with counseling or what we call cognitive behavioral therapy, because those are the mainstay of treating anxiety. And if after weeks of training, kids' anxiety does get worse, worse, then we might consider, using medication. For instance, I had a 9-year-old girl who suddenly couldn't fall asleep. She kept having what we call intrusive thoughts. She was convinced something bad was going to happen, and she sat there and worried, and it became like OCD. And this went on for months, and her mother tried everything. And she's 9, so she couldn't do CBT very well. And I remember talking to her mother because it was really disruptive. This child was, every single night, she'd stay up for an hour or two and just be terrified. And I remember I talked to her mother about just trying a whiff of something like Prozac. And we did. And sure enough, all of those intrusive thoughts went away. But we gave her that after probably 6 months of trying to change her thinking and to talk about her worries. The other thing I tell kids to do who are anxious is to keep a worry journal. I have them write down every single fearful thought they have. I'm afraid of dogs. The dog's going to bite me. I'm afraid of going to bed. I'm afraid of being away from my mom. I'm afraid of sleeping over at somebody's house at night. I'm afraid of school and friends and being embarrassed there. So I have them write it down, and there's something about externalizing your feelings, putting them on paper that helps diffuse the anxiety. And then I have them look at it and say, okay, what are the chances that you're going to be bitten by another dog? What are the chances that you're going to go to school and the teacher is going to be mean? And they start to realize that a lot of their fears really aren't founded in anything. And I found a worry journal really helps, particularly for young children.
Well, and there's a way too, I think, that helps for adults. When I go to yoga, at the end of a yoga class, most classes end in shavasana or corpse pose, where you're supposed to lay there and just totally relax, right? And my brain doesn't like to turn off. I like to start thinking about, oh, my kids are at home, but like they ordered a pizza and it could have been a killer. And I wonder if they're okay, or did I leave the oven on, and who are they going to? My brain, I'm the queen of just unrealistic thoughts. And what I have to do, which one of the yoga instructors said at one point, was just name those. And so I can name those ridiculous thoughts. Oh, actually, all right, that's fear. I'm dismissing it. It helps almost just to name the thing and then push it off away.
Well, that's exactly what a worry journal does. It helps kids identify what their fear is. Now, some kids can't. They have a generalized anxiety disorder. They're just kind of afraid of everything. But once you help them name their fear and help them name their feeling, does it make you mad? Does it make you sad? Does it make you scared? Does it make you feel like your heart races? Then you begin to talk to them about that. And then parents can even do cognitive behavioral therapy in a sort of a mini way. You can say, so what is the thought that comes to your mind over and over and over? What is the feeling that comes with that thought? And then you say to the kids, when you have that thought, here's what I want you to do. I want you to stop it, and I want you to replace it with this sentence. For instance, a dog is going to bite me. Now I'm scared. I don't want to walk in the neighborhood. And you say to that child, when you hear in your mind, a dog is going to bite me, you interrupt that thought and you say, I don't have to be afraid of dogs. I don't have to be afraid of dogs. And then as you change the child's thinking, and this will work for you too, then your feelings begin to change. And so for you, you could say, pizza's not going to hurt my kids.
Yeah.
Pizza's not going to hurt my kids. I can relax. So you're interrupting intrusive and negative and frightening thoughts. And this can take weeks or months, but it really works.
And this is where you have to correct me if I go down a totally wrong path. But I was listening to a podcast this morning, getting ready to talk to you today about anxiety. And this person tossed out this system in our brain called the reticular activating system. And this is the network of nerve pathways in the brainstem that connects to the spinal cord. And it basically is mediating, your consciousness. If I'm understanding this right, we can almost plant seeds in that part of our brain. So like when we're pregnant or trying to get pregnant, it's that part of our brain that all of a sudden only sees all the pregnant people. Or when we're looking for a certain car, all of a sudden, every car we see on the road is that car.
Right.
And so if we're replacing those bad thoughts with the good thoughts, even if we don't totally believe them yet, we're training that reticular, activating system in our brain to look for either all the good things or all the bad things. I mean, would you say that that's kind of a correct interpretation?
Absolutely. And then with children, I would broaden that. They have this activation that teaches them to focus on what they're afraid of, dogs, dogs, dogs. But then what happens is many of our kids live in a constant state of mild anxiety. They're constantly stimulated. They're on video games. They're listening to music. They're multitasking. They're running to sports. They never have quiet time. They never had that time that you have where they relax their body, they go outside and play. Our kids have constant stimulation, and this takes any anxiety and amps it up a couple notches. So this is why play is very important for kids. Downtime is very important. Shutting off screens are very important because there's audio and visual stimulation constantly. And this really causes kids to be anxious. That's what I've seen.
Even just that background noise, right? There's some homes where it's like there's always a TV going in the background. So I have consciously said, I want one TV. It's in the basement.
That's what we do too. And when our kids were growing up, we turned the television off for the whole summer. And the first 2 weeks of summer were horrible, because the kids would fight. They didn't know how to entertain themselves. They were so used to receiving entertainment and being entertained in sort of passive entertainment. They really didn't know, okay, what am I going to do with my boredom? How do I play with my sister and brother? But by the end of the summer, I will tell you, they're like different people. They loved being outside and playing with one another, and they didn't even care about the TV by the end of the summer. So I think it's very important to put kids on a screen diet and sort of say, here's a time they can watch screens, here's a time they can't, and to really learn how to balance that with kids.
Amen and hallelujah. I limit screens so much at my house. Last summer, I got really mad and I took all the screens away. There was no TV, no devices, nothing.
Yeah.
It was like midsummer, I'd had it, and I did it for the whole rest of the summer. I've got a girl in elementary school and then kids in junior high going into high school, and they all said thank you. They all noticed the difference in how they felt. If we're creating an environment that is that noise-filled, screen-filled place, we're handicapping them right out of the gates.
And think about what you're talking about, the reticular endothelial system. It's being fired, 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 fired. And kids can't live with that. It's too much. So they need the quiet, and they can't regulate quiet. Kids aren't going to do it. Even a teenager. So parents will say, well, they can't do it because they want to be on their phone. Well, they can't do it. So you need to do it for them. And if they have a temper tantrum and they scream and they slam doors, oh, well, it won't last forever. And, our son, when he was in his teen years, we wouldn't let him play video games. And he screamed and had a temper tantrum. He went off to college, and after his first year, he said, Mom, thank you so much. I would watch these guys spend hours and hours and hours in a dark dorm room, wasting their time playing video games. So it really is the habits that you put your brain in that are sustained as kids move into their adult years.
You're listening to the Today's Mama podcast with your host, Rachael Hersher. We'll be back right after this.
A lot of people have asked what natural solutions and alternatives there are for anxiety. I'm not a doctor, I'm not giving you any medical advice, but I will tell you what works at our house. We've been taking a micronutrient designed for the brain to help with calm, mood, and focus. It's backed by studies in over 25 scientific journals, and I'll tell you it's helped a lot at our house. My daughter has a tough time falling asleep at night. I picture an evil, tiny little hamster running around in her brain, telling her what to worry about. If she takes 2 Q96 each morning, she falls right asleep, no problem. She's brought her math grade from a C to an A, and she told me on her own that she felt like it was because when she takes her vitamins, it's easier for her to sit still in class. If you want to give it a shot, you can use the coupon code 20TODAYSMAMA, which is 20TODAYSMAMA to get 20% off your order on Amazon. That coupon expires September 1st. I'll put a link in the show notes, or you can just search for Q96 on Amazon. Back to the show.
And now back to the Today's Mama podcast with your host, Rachael Hersher.
We got another comment from someone from our Instagram feed who gave advice. She said, here's how I deal with my anxiety. 5 minutes of straight gratitude before bed. Make a list, and on a good note every night, even if your day was crap. And this was from, her name is Lindsay. If we're talking about retraining our brain, like you're saying, with those habits and those thought processes, we can do that as adults. But I mean, I got a little misty-eyed when I read it, when I thought, you know what, this is how we should shut the day down with our kids. 5 minutes of straight gratitude when we tuck them in.
Absolutely. And think about this. A child's brain, a teenager's brain, is much more malleable than an adult brain. In other words, you really can rewire the brain. And this is why kids who play a lot of video games and watch a lot of television, it really impacts their brain development. If, however, you get your kids to read and they engage in play and they engage with their friends, it rewires their brain in a positive direction. So as much as you can do it as an adult, multiply that 3 times, and that's what you're doing to a kid, even a teenager.
I mean, hardwiring their brain for happiness.
Yes.
It's almost, that's our job as parents, bringing up their emotional IQ, emotional intelligence, and just trying to hardwire their little brains for happiness. That is like my mission.
Yeah, exactly. And mine too.
Yes.
And it works. I want to tell parents that it really works, because I've seen a lot of kids who are addicted to television, their social media. And when you start to dial it down, which takes a tremendous amount of energy and fortitude and a backbone of steel for parents to do, kids turn into different people. They are less depressed. They are more social. They engage with people better. They're more likely to do other things, to learn to stimulate themselves and not just receive. So all good things happen when we do that.
Well, here's a couple things I'm doing at my house to try to hardwire my kids.
Great.
With my youngest, I have her doing this summer this really fun little journal called the Big Life Journal, which is all about just positive thinking. With my older kids, I will send them podcast episodes to listen to that are examples of healthy thinking and processing to me. But one of the things we do a lot at our house is just naming emotions. And I've done it since they were toddlers. Oh, you're frustrated, you're angry. It's getting them to recognize how they're feeling. So like my teenagers actually only access Instagram through my phone these days. But if they get on there and they realize they're not feeling good, I say, okay, what are you feeling? I think you're feeling FOMO right now. Maybe you're feeling left out. Maybe you're,
great.
And helping them identify what their emotions are in the first place. So that's kind of what we're doing. What else do you recommend for parents to hardwire their kids?
Well, I think that's a great idea. However, some kids, even though you tell them over and over, they don't want to say they're feeling that way because they know what you're trying to do. For instance, we have great studies that show that social media use in girls leads to depression. And of course, when you have depression, you often have anxiety. You may say to a 16-year-old or 15-year-old, how do you feel when you're watching social media? And she'll go, fine, I feel good. I like seeing what my friends are doing. When in fact, it's making her feel terrible because she's comparing her life, her looks, her clothes with everybody else out there, and she can never live up to that. So with teenagers, it's a little trickier because they know if they say, oh, I just feel bad about myself, and then you say, okay, we need to dial that down, they will say, no, no, no. So pretty soon they get pretty good at not telling you the truth.
Yeah, maneuvering around you. And I'll tell you when I got them to admit to me that they didn't feel good. It was when we took a really big break and I took all the social media off their phones and now they can only get to it through my phone. It was when we went back to it. And I said, okay, how do you feel? And then they were like, oh,
Yeah.
because sometimes I don't think they realize they're feeling it because they're on it so much. And when you take that big break and then they feel it again, they realize, oh, this doesn't feel good. And same thing, when I moved Instagram off, they were like mad at me and they continue to thank me for taking it.
I mean, they can absolutely have temper tantrums. That's why when I have a child or teen who has anxiety and depression and we're treating it, I have to ask the parent, how do you think your child's feeling? Because when kids are depressed or anxious, they can't identify it. However, a parent will see a change in their demeanor and behavior and mood. So kids in the midst of something, that feels like normal life to them. And the only time they realize that they were depressed is when their depression lifts. And they go, wow, 6 months ago, I felt this way and this way and this way, and I don't feel that way now. So it's the same principle that you're talking about. When your kids are on social media playing video games or whatever on their screens, they feel fine. They think, well, this is normal life. And then when you give them a break and they go back, they realize, ugh, that really did make me feel bad. I was feeling this way 4 or 5 months ago.
Yes. Yeah, but you've got to come out of the haze to realize it, right?
You do. And kids won't come out of the haze. This has to be intentional on the part of the parent. And this is where I think parents, they go astray because parents think, well, my child is okay. And this is what all the other friends do. And I don't want her to feel like the odd person out, or my son to feel the odd person out. Or they say, well, I won't let my child do it at my house, but he or she's just going to go to somebody else's house and do it. Oh, well, but they're not going to do it on your watch. And kids know because they look up and respect their parents. And underneath everything, they really do want to please their parents. If it's not okay with you and they're playing it at somebody's house, something is going to get triggered in them and they're going to want to go, I shouldn't really be doing this. But when you have it in your house, kids feel like you're sanctioning it, even though you don't like it.
And you know what? You have to do the work at some point. You're either going to do the work with your kids up front, which is work, setting and holding boundaries and all that stuff, or you're going to do the work on the back end, which is almost the therapeutic side or whatever it is to try and bring back boundaries. And at some point you have to set them, right? I don't think there's any way out of it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I just wrote a really comprehensive course about positive discipline and disciplining with courage and kindness, and how really discipline is an act of love, and it's about setting boundaries for kids. It's not about being mean or harsh or cracking down. It's teaching kids that through the years, there have to be boundaries. And first you have to impose the boundaries. And then as kids get older, they begin to impose those things on themselves.
Yeah, because you've taught them how to self-regulate.
Yeah, and they have to feel what it's like to live with limits and rules. Because the truth of the matter is you and I live with a lot of limits and rules. You can't run a stop sign or red light. You can't go out and scream at your boss. You can't scream at your husband. Life doesn't go well for adults if we don't have clear boundaries. So to not teach them to our children is really pretty mean, because that's what life is all about.
That makes them feel out of control, which is also that cycle of anxiety, right? Things don't feel in control. They don't know where the edge is.
Absolutely. And kids who make the rules because parents say, well, they want to do that. I want them to come to the realization that they shouldn't. That's not going to happen. And when a child feels they're making their rules, they feel they have power. And that is terrifying to kids because they want mom and dad to be the authority and have the power. Now, I don't mean power over kids and being overly authoritarian and militant. I'm talking about type of parent whose child can respect them and go, okay, mom and dad are going to keep me safe. And even though, they're making my curfew 11 o'clock and I hate it, mom and dad ultimately are making me safe. So if a teenager gets to decide their curfew, they feel very uncomfortable, they feel out of control, and they feel like they're not loved.
Well, and I think even if we boil it back to the younger kids, pushing those boundaries of whether it's that you're eating chicken nuggets for every meal or whatever it is, when they're running the show, I feel like it does that similar thing where they don't know where the edge is.
I recently saw an 11-year-old child who was 40 pounds overweight. And I was very concerned about this. So I started to talk to her mom about it. And she goes, shh, we don't talk about that because it's going to hurt her self-esteem. I said, what really hurts her self-esteem is not being able to play soccer and run with her friends. When I took a dietary history, this child was eating 2 breakfasts. She was eating 2 lunches, and she only ate pizza and pasta. And when I asked her mother why, she said, that's what she does and that's what she likes. Well, I said, but it's not healthy for her. We need to, pare that down to 1 breakfast and 1 serving and 1 lunch. And she wouldn't do it because she wanted the child to make all the decisions. Well, I'll tell you, that child felt really out of control. Her eating was out of control. This is really harmful for kids.
Well, I think we're afraid to push our kids. In some instances, you've got parents who are pushing their kids too far. And in others, we're afraid to push them or put, other constraints on them. And we actually got another question from Instagram from her name's Becky. And she said, how do you know when to push them and when not to push them to grow through their anxiety? Because sometimes they're probably in a place that they need the space and they're not ready to be pushed. But then when are they? That feels like a really tricky place for parents to be.
Yeah. Well, I sort of divide that in 2 things. If you're pushing a child to hyper perform, you've got them in 2 sports or 1, travel soccer team year round, and they're exhausted, and then they're doing their academics on top of it, and they're never being with your parent or family. That's where you need to back off, because kids feel like puppets. And I see this. And what happens is they hit sophomore year in high school and they're done. As far as anxiety, for instance, I'm afraid of the dog and I won't go out in my neighborhood to walk. What you do with specific phobias, even phobias about school, I have a stomach ache, I don't want to go to 2nd grade. You desensitize them over time. So you take them in the neighborhood and you look at dogs in pictures. Then maybe you walk them by a dog who is in your neighborhood but behind a fence. Just like you would do if you had claustrophobia and you wouldn't get in an elevator. You stand outside the elevator, open the door, and look in it. Then you open the door and shut them, and you put your feet in and you jump out. So that's how you really learn to plow your kids through anxiety, by desensitizing them and make them realize you can look at a dog and you can pet a dog and you're really okay.
And I think there's 2 parts to that: identifying the thing, and then there's an action plan to deal with the thing, right? So in that case, it was a dog, but we had a really great comment from a woman named Liz who said she has a daughter who, in her words, massively struggles with anxiety. And she said, one thing I have found is that her anxiety is usually triggered by one of 4 things: hunger, loneliness, tiredness, or boredom. If she starts to get panicky, I ask her if she's any of those things, and we can usually address the trigger to calm down the anxiety. I think people with anxiety have to become very self-aware, which is actually such a positive thing. But that's something we've got to train our kids to do, right? There's obvious situations where the dog is causing the anxiety, and there's other situations where they may just feel this overwhelming sense of dread and anxiousness.
Oh, yeah. I mean, kids who have generalized anxiety disorders or panic disorders. When a child has a panic attack, they have no idea why they're having a panic attack. And most adults who have a panic attack don't know either. So sometimes there's this general sort of anxiety below the surface and they can't figure it out. Most kids who are under 10 can't self-identify. That's a learned skill over the years. So you can help them with that. The other thing that's important is to say, you feel anxious when you're hungry. So when you're hungry, let's listen to music. Let's go outside and play. Let's do a craft. So you're replacing what you do in the anxiety with something positive.
I love that. Now, this question, I think, works for grown-ups and kids. Anxiety can often come with a sense of fear or dread, that overwhelming sense that something's wrong. We want to teach our kids to listen to their gut, but in these instances, their gut's almost leading them the wrong way, right? So how can we teach kids and ourselves the difference between listening to our gut or intuition, or for some people, they may say that could be a spiritual prompting or warning, and what anxiety is? How can we teach people to tell the difference between the two things?
Well, it's hard with kids, and I don't know that kids can know, because kids just feel what they feel. Beneath anxiety, there's always fear. There's always fear and overstimulation, and the overstimulation feeds the fear. And what we need to do is help kids say, okay, I'm afraid, specifically say what you're afraid of if you can, or I'm panicky, but here's the thing. And then you say to them, what's the worst thing that can happen to you when you feel panicky and your heart rate's up and you start sweating and you just feel like, I can't do this, I can't do this. So you sort of walk them through. It's the worst thing that can happen. Well, I'm going to die, Mom. Well, you're not going to die. So you kind of bring them through that process, and then you talk about the fact that their fear really isn't going to come, thing they're afraid of really isn't going to happen. So first you start very, very general, because a 10-year-old, even a 15-year-old is going to have a hard time thinking, I'm having a panic attack. What am I afraid of? Sometimes they have no clue, but they feel out of control. So the key is with the anxiety, particularly if it's general, is to help them do something where they're in control. So you move them from being afraid of being out of control, which is exactly what a panic attack is, and then help them do something in the moment where they are in control. And that really helps.
What are some things that you think make kids feel in control? Simple acts, or where can you point your kids if there's just something that needs to ground them?
Well, I would find what kids are good at and what they like to do. And I would have them do something. For instance, if someone's really good at coloring and they color in the lines, if they're a young child, you say, sit down. I know you're really great at coloring in the lines. Even something like that helps a child be in control. If an older kid is a soccer player and they're really good with their feet and manipulating a ball, you have them do that. You can even have them sit down and eat if they have a lot of control over their eating, and say, see, you finished your spaghetti. You didn't have another plate of spaghetti. Good for you. You can do this. So it's important to find something they're good at that you've seen them control before, and you bring them back to that.
I love that. It has to do with action. Again, it's identifying something and being able to take an action. So, there's been times where I have woken up in the morning just feeling anxious, and I don't know why. And so one of the things that I started to do was like, all right, if I feel anxious today, here's my set of actions that I can take. I'm just actually marrying these things to what you're saying as we speak. Is I will go ride my spin bike. I will play scales on the piano, because that seems to just like reset my brain. I'll go on a walk. I have to take action, as opposed to being like, I'm just going to stay in bed for another hour. And certainly there are some days where you could stay in bed another hour and that's appropriate. But for me, it's the action piece and getting my brain oriented in the right direction.
Yeah. And the other thing you need to do is you need to identify the thought that's making you afraid. Yes. I'm worried my kids are going to get in a car accident today. I'm worried my kids are going to get bullied at school. I'm worried about blank, blank, blank. And as you change your thoughts, your feelings start to change, and they follow along. And the important thing is, as you're saying, okay, I'm very afraid, I'm very anxious, I'm going to get out of bed and I'm going to get on my spin bike. And as I'm doing my spin bike, I'm going to talk to myself and replace the anxious thoughts with gratitude thoughts or positive thoughts. Changing your thinking, changing your behavior ultimately changes your emotions.
That's the whole goal, is just to shift, to teach it, to help them shift, and to do that work ourselves is the thing that will bring everybody progress with anxiety.
Exactly. And I'm glad you brought that up because very often with anxious kids, I see anxious parents. I see parents who are very, very, very protective, overprotective, and they tell their kids things like, don't go outside in the summertime without sunscreen because you're going to get cancer. I don't want you to drive in the car alone, or, I don't want you to drive because you're going to get in a car accident. I don't want you to do this or that because something bad is going to happen. And so if a parent communicates to a child that something around the corner bad is going to happen, then the child's going to be anxious. Additionally, if a parent is anxious all the time, kids pick up on that and think, gee whiz, if my mom and dad is that worried, I better be worried too. So there's a lot of mimicking of behavior. So if mom and dad work on their anxiety and keep a calm demeanor in the home, kids are more likely to have a calm demeanor.
And this goes back to what we talked about in setting that quiet environment,
yes,
or that place that they can come for that peace and unplugging. You parents, you are part of that environment. We are controlling the weather, right? I think we all could do a better job.
And I think that that's an important thing to recognize is that, many times we get very anxious. I get anxious because I have a lot of work to do and I'm afraid I'm going to get behind. I got anxious because I was late to the podcast and I, had the time mixed up and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to fail. I think that when we control our behavior and we set a calm tone and we really deal with that and we create quiet in our homes, it really calms our kids. Parents modeling calm and lack of anxiety and making sure that kids aren't overstimulated 24/7.
Creating a home that's a respite from everything else that's in our ear all day long.
Yes, and home should be the safe place where you are happy and you wind down and you relax and you are fully yourself. It shouldn't be a place where you're running around or, you can't go outside and play because you've got so much to do and so much homework. I see that all the time in teenagers and young children.
And, I think there's little things too that we could do. And I'm not saying we should create a bunch more unrealistic work for ourselves as parents, but little things. I know I've got a daughter who gets a little anxious. It's just the little ritual of putting a little lavender on her pillow at night that adds to that environment of calm and is kind of something that helps wind her down.
Yeah.
Or there's times where I know, like on the first day of school, it's a big day. I make a Danish bundt cake. So when my kids walk through the door, they smell cinnamon out of the oven.
There you go. And that's very calming and reassuring, and mom's in charge.
Meg, I could talk to you all day long. We need to have you back like every month. I'm going to nail you down.
Oh, and I love to talk and I love kids. And I'll tell you, I've been at this a long time. And many years ago, I realized that the best thing I can do for kids is help their parents. So that's why I'm really devoted to helping parents, because parents have the power. I don't have the power. Parents have the power. So really empowering parents is when you get a lot of change in kids.
And we're going to have some resources, some follow-up resources for parents on the website, that they can access. You can find the links in the show notes. We'll have some good advice from Meg. We'll have some other posts on topics that we talked about today so that you can follow up and get the information you need to start doing some of these things in your home and making a difference with that environment and the feelings that are happening inside your house. Meg, where can people find you online?
MegMeekerMD.com. And I have a podcast too. It's called Parenting Great Kids.
And I know you have so many books and courses. What's your latest stuff? What should people be running to pick up at this very moment?
It was my comprehensive kind of fun course I wrote on discipline with courage and kindness. And I really walk parents through sort of changing their view of it. And when they change their view of discipline, they relax more. Their kids stop acting up. And it's not about yelling no to your kids all day. It's really about teaching their kids. So I'm very excited about that. I have videos of me talking. I have audio. I have written things. I answer questions on very specific topics. So that's what I'm excited about, Rachael.
Okay, so for our listeners, make sure you go find her, follow her online, pick up some books. What I love about her is her down-to-earth approach. And I think everything she said today and everything you'll find in her books and elsewhere is so actionable and really makes a difference. So Meg, thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you, Rachel.
All right, did you feel that? There were actual nuggets of gold coming out of this episode of the podcast. Here's the point that Meg made today that hit me the most. Constant stimulation keeps our kids in a state of mild anxiety. I know there were so many brilliant bits of knowledge that she dropped on us, but that one just clicked for me. I'm all about making our house a respite from the outside world. I want to know, what do you do at your house to create calm? So I'm going to start a conversation on todaysmama.com, and I'd love to have you join it. Again, I'll leave a link in the show notes. We'd love to hear from you. Come and tell us what you do at your house to create calm. That's all for today. We'll catch you next time.
You've been listening to the Today's Mama podcast with Rachael Hersher. To find out more, go to todaysmama.com. That's today's, MAMA.com. Today's Mama, connecting moms and families with the best of today.